The South African Poultry Association says it rejects rebates on chicken. SAPA says there's no need for imported chicken into the country. This as the International Trade Administration Commission's decision to implement rebates on chickens comes after the poultry industry suffered an influenza outbreak late last year. ITAC says it recommends that the initial rebate permits be issued for a 3-month period with a 6-month window for applications based on the highly pathogenic avian flu influenza, HPAI.
From outside. Because the one produced in South Africa is expensive. And the chicken we get from outside is not chicken. It's the rejects and the leftovers. Rejects and leftovers doesn't mean expired rotten food. The Americans choose. They don't eat everything on the body of the chicken. All those parts that they don't eat, they send to us. So they don't like things like wings. They are people of a breast and things like that. The rest, they put it there and then they come to South Africa. Those are rejects of America.
Popular animal product in South Africa is poultry meat. And now that $20 billion market is at the center of a trade disagreement with the U.S. The U.S. is warning South Africa that it could lose a lucrative trade deal if it doesn't open up that market.
Welcome back. The dispute between South Africa and the United States over chicken import duties continues to hang over South Africa's extended inclusion in the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. 2 United States senators have threatened to try to block South Africa from the lucrative U.S.-Africa trade agreement if the country doesn't lift import duties on cheaper cuts of chicken.
The message hit Washington like a thunderclap. South Africa has officially shut out U.S. chicken imports, delivering a stunning blow to an industry that has long relied on African markets for expansion and dominance. For years, American poultry giants operated with near-total confidence, shipping frozen chicken quarters, drumsticks, and mechanically processed poultry across continents as if the market belonged to them by default. But today, that illusion shattered, because this time Africa said no. This wasn't a quiet policy tweak or a slow phase-out. It wasn't wrapped in diplomatic language or buried in trade paperwork. No, South Africa pulled the plug in one clean, bold, unapologetic move, and the result? The United States is now staring down a staggering $450 million loss that nobody saw coming, and yet everyone should have. What makes this moment historic isn't just the size of that number. It's what it represents: a continental shift in power, confidence, and economic independence. For the first time in decades, African nations are no longer playing the role of passive importers. They're calculating, strategizing, protecting their industries, and rewriting the rules of global trade. South Africa's decision didn't emerge overnight. Behind closed doors, pressure had been building for years. Local poultry farmers were drowning under the flood of cheaper U.S. imports, frozen stock so inexpensive that no domestic producer could ever hope to compete. Every year, thousands of tons of chicken poured in, undermining local businesses, killing local jobs, and threatening to collapse an entire sector. But now the story has changed dramatically. South Africa's message is clear: either respect our industry or step aside. And it turns out, America wasn't ready for this level of pushback. Reports from trade analysts say U.S. poultry exporters are already scrambling, calling emergency meetings, demanding explanations, and lobbying Washington for urgent intervention. But there is no quick fix, not this time. The era where major Western economies dictated terms without resistance is quickly fading, and South Africa's move proves it. At the center of this decision lies one undeniable truth: Africa is raising its voice in global trade, and the world is being forced to listen. For years, economists predicted that Africa, particularly nations like South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, would eventually challenge Western dominance in agriculture and food production. But few expected the shift to be this fast, this confident, and this costly for the United States. The shockwaves are immense. American poultry companies, some of the biggest in the world, now find themselves suddenly locked out of a market they've depended on for decades. And unlike previous disagreements, this time the political tone is different. Africa is no longer pleading for negotiations. Instead, South Africa is standing with a united front of African agricultural blocs that have voiced the same demand. We will protect our farmers. We will grow our industries. We are no longer dumping grounds for foreign surplus. This boldness isn't just inspiring. It's contagious. Within hours of the announcement, whispers circulated across West and East Africa. Officials in Ghana, Tanzania, Zambia, and Cote d'Ivoire began hinting at similar reviews of U.S. poultry and agricultural imports. Suddenly, the situation America considered just a South Africa issue is starting to look more like the beginning of a much bigger continental stance. For the United States, the timing couldn't be worse. After years of trade tensions with China, supply chain disruptions, inflation, and weakening global influence, losing Africa's trust and market share is a blow Washington cannot afford. And losing nearly $500 million because of one strategic decision by South Africa is only the beginning. But here's where things get even more interesting. Behind this trade shock lies a larger global trend, one the U.S. underestimated. Africa has been aggressively modernizing its agricultural and poultry sectors. Investments from within the continent, along with partnerships from Asia and the Middle East, have turbocharged local production. South Africa itself has recently upgraded processing plants, improved storage technology, strengthened food safety standards, and increased farmer subsidies. African poultry is now competing, not just surviving. In short, the continent no longer needs U.S. chicken. And that reality is what truly terrifies American exporters. South Africa's new regulations didn't simply shut the door, they set a precedent. They sent a clear message to Africa and the world. It's time for fair trade, not trade domination. It is time for nations to stand up and protect their own industries rather than being manipulated through price wars and dumping tactics. This is a moment of economic awakening. It's a moment billions of Africans have been waiting for. And as global markets react, one thing is becoming obvious. What South Africa did today has the potential to reshape agricultural trade across continents. Africa is no longer just a market, it is a competitor, a producer, a global force, demanding respect. And while America scrambles to assess the damage and recover from the unexpected $450 million hit, one question now dominates the conversation in every trade office, economics department, and political think tank. If South Africa can do this, who's next? Because this wasn't just about chicken, this was about power, and Africa just proved it has more of it than the world ever expected. The fallout from South Africa's decision didn't stop at poultry. In the hours and days that followed, the world realized something far bigger was happening, something that went well beyond chicken. This was a test of global influence, a silent referendum on who truly holds economic power in the 21st century, and the answer was shifting right before everyone's eyes. Inside the halls of Washington, the atmosphere turned icy. Reports leaked of senior trade officials pacing, arguing, and scrambling to draft responses. They weren't just stunned by the $450 million loss, they were stunned by what it symbolized. Deep down, they knew this wasn't simply a South African move. It was the spark that could ignite a Pan-African trade revolution, and that's exactly what began. Within 48 hours, agricultural alliances from West Africa, East Africa, and the Horn of Africa released statements applauding South Africa's decision. For the first time, African trade blocs spoke with one voice, firm and unapologetic. We support policies that protect African markets, African farmers, and African industry. This was the kind of unity major world powers had quietly feared for decades. Across the continent, local farmers celebrated. For years, they had been forced to compete against imported U.S. chicken priced so cheaply that no local producer could survive. It wasn't a fair market, it was an economic avalanche. Local businesses collapsed, generational farms shut down, unemployment climbed, but overnight, the tide turned. South African farmers spoke emotionally in interviews. We finally have room to breathe, we can rebuild our industry, Africa needs this. And it wasn't just talk. Demand for local poultry surged, processing plants announced expansion plans, jobs began to return. For the first time in years, the sector felt alive, driven not by foreign aid or foreign pressure, but by a firm African decision. Meanwhile, the mood in America was tense. Poultry giants that had dominated African markets for decades suddenly found themselves locked out of a trade route they thought they'd never lose. Panic surged across boardrooms, CEOs demanded answers, export managers repeated the same question: how did we lose South Africa? Because losing South Africa wasn't just losing revenue, it was losing influence. For years, the U.S. used poultry exports as a foothold to shape agricultural markets across Africa. That foothold had just collapsed, and Washington knew other African nations were watching. Then came the twist America feared most: China moved in. Quietly, efficiently, and without grand statements, Chinese trade representatives arrived in African capitals Johannesburg, Nairobi, Dakar, ready to negotiate expanded poultry partnerships, frozen storage investments, shipping facilities, and long-term agricultural cooperation. While America saw a crisis, China saw an opening, and Africa, Africa's all leverage. Suddenly, the global trade game shifted. The US needed Africa's markets, China wanted Africa's partnerships, Europe feared losing access to African supply chains, and Africa realized the world needed what it had. South Africa's decision wasn't just about chicken, it was about bargaining power. In emergency meetings, European officials expressed concern. If South Africa could shut out the US, what would prevent them or any African nation from restricting European agricultural imports next? What would happen if Africa used trade as a diplomatic weapon? Middle Eastern analysts watched closely as well. Africa was no longer just a supplier or a customer, it was emerging as a trade superpower, armed with the world's youngest population and rapidly growing economies. Across the continent, a wave of pride surged. For decades, many Africans watched their industries crumble under foreign competition. They heard promises of protecting local markets but rarely saw action. South Africa's move struck at something deeper: identity, dignity, respect. Across social media, young Africans turned the moment into a movement. Hashtags like #AfricaFirst, #SupportAfrican Farmers, and #BuildAfrica by Africa exploded across platforms. Influencers, entrepreneurs, and musicians called it a historic turning point. One viral comment captured the mood perfectly. This is not about chicken. This is about respect. For years, global powers treated African markets as predictable places where influence could be bought, where surplus goods could be dumped, and where local industries were too weak to resist, but not anymore. Africa's economic rise wasn't just theoretical, it was happening. Inside African parliaments, lawmakers began discussing new protection measures, updated food safety standards, and long-term plans to grow domestic poultry industries. South Africa's move gave them proof. The world would adjust to Africa's decisions, not the other way around. But while Africa grew more confident, pressure mounted in the United States. Senators from poultry-producing states demanded federal intervention. They wanted quick negotiations. They wanted tariff threats. They wanted retaliation. They wanted the old trade order restored. Yet Washington knew a truth it didn't want to say publicly. There was nothing they could threaten South Africa with that wouldn't backfire. Africa didn't need American chicken anymore. And Africa didn't need American leverage. For the first time in decades, the United States would have to approach Africa as an equal, not a superior. This is why Act II became the turning point. The shockwaves of South Africa's decision were not merely economic, they were psychological, political, and geopolitical. The world now understood that Africa was no longer a silent participant in global trade. It was a force capable of reshaping supply chains with a single policy shift. As America struggled to process a sudden $450 million loss, Africa stood taller than ever, more united, more confident, and more economically ambitious. But beneath all the celebration, one question rose quietly across global markets, a question that would define the next decade of global trade. If Africa can shut out America's chicken, what else can Africa shut out? It was the beginning of a new era, and the world knew it.